Right now today, ships are stuck in the mud on the most important river in America. Not small boats, not recreational crafts, fully loaded commercial cargo ships sitting motionless in a channel that does not have enough water to float them. Captains are being told to offload their cargo before they are allowed to move. Grain is sitting on riverbanks in Illinois that was supposed to be in New Orleans weeks ago. Coal is parked on a sandbar in Missouri that was supposed to be heating homes. Fertilizer that farmers need for next season is stranded somewhere between St. Louis and Memphis going nowhere. That is not a prediction. That is not a worst-case scenario. That is what is happening on the Mississippi River right now. The water is down 45%, not from last year, from where it is supposed to be. And here's the part that nobody is saying out loud. The Mississippi River moves 1/3 of everything shipped inside the United States. 1/3. It is not a river in the background of American life. It is the backbone of it. The food on your table, the gas in your car, the electricity in your house, all of it at some point in the chain came through that river. And that river is collapsing. Over 2,000 barges were stranded on the Mississippi system during the worst of the recent crisis. 2,000, stretched across hundreds of miles of river, waiting for water that was not coming, carrying cargo that was not moving, costing money that nobody had budgeted for because nobody had planned for the river to stop working. This has happened before. It will happen again. And every time it happens, it lasts longer and costs more than the time before it. So the real question is not whether the Mississippi River has a problem. It does. The question is whether the country that built its entire interior economy on this river is ready to face what happens when the river stops being something it can count on. Because the evidence is building that that moment is coming. The Mississippi River is not just a river. It runs 2,340 miles. From a quiet lake in northern Minnesota, so small you can step across the outflow in rubber boots, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico south of New Orleans. Along the way, it drains 41% of the entire continental United States. 31 states pour their water into this system. Parts of 2 Canadian provinces do too. It is the 3rd largest river basin on Earth, behind only the Amazon and the Congo, and through it moves more commerce than most countries generate in a year. Over 500 million tons of goods travel the Mississippi and its connected waterways every single year. The raw materials and finished products that keep the American economy running move through this river the way blood moves through a body. Constantly, quietly, completely taken for granted until something goes wrong. Here's what that volume means in practical terms. Moving 1 ton of cargo 1 mile by river costs roughly 1/3 of what it costs by rail and 1/10 of what it costs by truck. The Mississippi is not just a shipping route. It is the reason American agriculture is competitive on the global market at all. Without it, the math of feeding the world from the American interior does not work. The prices go up, the exports slow down, and the countries that buy American grain start looking for other sellers. That river is sitting 45% below where it needs to be, and the ships are stuck in the mud. The Mississippi does not generate its own water. It collects it. Rain that falls across half the country eventually finds a stream. That stream finds a river. That river finds the Mississippi. The whole system is one giant funnel, and what comes out at the bottom in New Orleans is the sum of everything that fell from the sky across 31 states over the previous weeks and months. When it rains normally across the basin, the river runs normally. When the basin goes dry, the Mississippi feels all of it. Every dry field in Iowa, every rainless week in Tennessee, every thin winter in Minnesota, they all show up eventually in the river gauge at Memphis. The river has always had seasons. Higher in spring when the snow melts. Lower in late summer when the heat is relentless and the rain is scarce. Water managers built the entire shipping industry around those rhythms. They dredged the channel and built the locks and told the shipping companies what they could count on. What they could not count on was the rhythms changing. The droughts hitting the Mississippi Basin in recent decades have been deeper and longer than the ones the system was designed to handle. The low water events that used to come once a decade are arriving more often. The recovery periods between them are getting shorter. The river is spending more time near its lows and less time at the levels that allow fully loaded ships to pass without running aground. The shipping industry built its entire business model on a river that no longer entirely exists. In the fall of 2022, the lower Mississippi dropped to levels not seen in decades, not since 1988. The worst river low in modern memory at that point. Had water managers seen numbers like the ones on their gauges that autumn. And in some locations, the 2022 event was worse. At Memphis, the river dropped roughly 10 feet below its normal low water mark. At Vicksburg, sandbars rose out of the channel in places that had been open navigable water for years. At New Orleans, the port that handles more tonnage than any other port in the Western Hemisphere watched the depth readings with alarm. The channel that ocean-going ships used to reach the port was narrowing. The margin between the hull of a loaded vessel and the bottom of the river was shrinking towards zero. Barges that normally carry 1,500 tons of grain had to cut their loads to 1,000 tons, then to 800, then to 600. Every ton removed from a barge to keep it floating was a ton that had to move another way, by truck, by rail, at costs 3 times and 10 times higher than the river rate. The price of shipping a bushel of corn from the Midwest to the export terminals at New Orleans roughly doubled during the worst of the low water. That cost did not disappear. It moved into the price of the corn at the elevator, into the margin of the farmer in Iowa who was already watching the same drought burning through his fields above ground. The river took the hit from below. The drought took the hit from above. The farmer stood in the middle of both. More than 2,000 barges were delayed somewhere on the Mississippi system. 2,000, strung across hundreds of miles of river, waiting for water that was not coming, carrying cargo that was not moving. That is not a worst-case scenario. That is what already happened. The river does not just carry grain. Most people picture grain barges when they think about the Mississippi. Flat-bottomed boats pushed by a towboat through brown water past flat farmland. That image is real. It is also incomplete. The Mississippi carries coal to power plants that keep the lights on for millions of households. When the river runs low and coal shipments slow, those plants burn through their stockpiles faster than the barges can replenish them. The utilities start making contingency plans. Those plans cost money. That money shows up on power bills in towns that are nowhere near the river. The river carries the raw materials for fertilizers and industrial products that American manufacturing depends on. A disruption in those shipments does not stay inside one industry. It spreads into every industry downstream that uses those materials to make something else. It carries heating oil moving south to north before winter, refined fuel heading to distribution hubs that supply gas stations across the interior of the country. When those shipments slow, the supply tightens, and the price at the pump reflects it in communities that have never seen the Mississippi and have no idea the river is why their gas suddenly costs more. Low water on the Mississippi does not just hurt farmers. It does not just hurt shippers. It reaches into the cost of nearly everything made or grown or built in the interior of the United States, because nearly everything made or grown or built in the interior has some connection to the river that moved it somewhere. 2,000 stuck barges in 2022 was not a shipping problem. It was an economic event that most Americans never saw and never connected to its cause. There is a number the Army Corps of Engineers watches more closely than any other when it comes to the navigability of the Mississippi: 9 feet. 9 feet is the minimum depth of the main navigation channel required by Congress. The entire lock and dam system on the upper river and the entire dredging operation on the lower river exist for one purpose: keep the channel at or above 9 feet so that commercial traffic can move. When the river drops below 9 feet, the channel cannot be guaranteed. Ships must reduce their loads. Some cannot move at all. The system that 500 million tons of cargo depends on every year begins to break down piece by piece, barge by barge, until the rain comes back and the water rises and the traffic starts moving again. In 2022, stretches of the lower Mississippi dropped below 9 feet. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. The dredges the Army Corps deploys to maintain the channel were running around the clock. Dredging is the emergency response the government has when the river drops, essentially vacuuming sediment off the river bottom to preserve depth. It works within limits. Those limits were tested in 2022 in ways they had not been tested in a generation. The dredges can maintain a channel. They cannot manufacture water. When the river is low enough, the sediment fills back in faster than the dredges can remove it. The machines run. The channel shrinks anyway. The ships wait. At the height of the 2022 low water event, the Army Corps was spending money on emergency dredging at a pace the annual maintenance budget had not accounted for. The river was costing more to manage as a crisis than it had ever cost to maintain as a functioning system. That is what happens when the water is gone. Everything gets more expensive. Everything gets slower. The people who need it most pay the difference. The Mississippi River has a connection to every person in the United States, whether they know it or not. The river moves 60% of all grain exported from the United States. The United States is the largest grain exporter on Earth. That means the Mississippi is, in a direct and literal sense, one of the most important pieces of food infrastructure on the entire planet. When the river struggles, it is not just American farmers who feel it. It is grain buyers in Egypt, bread prices in Indonesia, food security calculations in countries that feed their populations with American exports. The 45% drop in the Mississippi is not a regional story. It is a global one, dressed in the specific details of a river most of the world has never seen. 40 million people depend on the Colorado River. That number gets discussed and debated and worried over. 500 million tons of cargo move through the Mississippi every year. That number does not get discussed at all. Not outside the industry that moves it. Not in the cities whose residents benefit from every ton of it without ever thinking about the water that carried it to them. The river is invisible to the people it serves most completely. Congress has known about the Mississippi River's vulnerability for a long time. The Army Corps studies are there. The economic analyses documenting what a major low-water event costs the American economy are there. They have been produced and delivered and discussed in committee and largely not acted on at the scale the problem demands. The political challenge is that the Mississippi is invisible to most voters. It is not invisible to the people who live near it, but most Americans do not. They live in cities on the coasts or in suburbs far from any navigable waterway, and their connection to the river is so many steps removed, through food prices and power bills and manufacturing costs, that they never make the link. A problem that most voters cannot see does not generate the political pressure needed to fund the solution at the scale required. The Army Corps receives annual appropriations for river maintenance that water managers describe carefully as insufficient for what the river now demands. The lock and dam system on the upper river needs investment that has been discussed for 30 years. The dredging capacity for low water emergencies is adequate for normal events and dangerously stretched when the events stop being normal. Disaster declarations get signed. Emergency dredging funds get released. The federal machinery of crisis response activates and produces what crisis response always produces: reports, appropriations, task forces, timelines. None of it can make it rain. The communities along the Mississippi have a complicated relationship with the water. They need it high enough to be navigable. They need it low enough not to flood. They have spent 2 centuries trying to find that balance, and the river has never made it easy. The Great Mississippi Floods of 1927 and 1993 and 2011 are as much a part of the river's history as the Great Droughts. The river has always swung between extremes that the communities on its banks had to absorb generation after generation. What is different now is that the swings are getting wider. The same climate patterns producing deeper droughts and lower low water events are also producing heavier rainfall and more severe flooding when the rain finally arrives. The river is spending more time at its extremes and less time in the middle range that the infrastructure was built to manage. Communities that flooded in 2011 with water at record high levels were watching the same channel run at record low levels just 11 years later. The river that tried to drown them tried to abandon them in the same decade. The people who live along the Mississippi do not describe this as a crisis. They describe it as the river. This is what the river does. This is what living here means. There is a fatalism in those communities that comes from generations of absorbing what the water gives and what it takes. But even the people most accustomed to the swings are noticing they have changed. The lows are lower. The recovery is slower. The rhythms they built their lives around are not as reliable as they used to be. The shipping industry is adapting. It has no other choice. When the river drops, the industry does not stop. It adjusts. Loads get reduced. Schedules get extended. Trucks and rail fill in for barges at costs that compress margins and sometimes eliminate them entirely. The companies that move cargo on the Mississippi now have contingency playbooks for low-water events that did not exist 30 years ago. 30 years ago, events of this severity were rare enough that a playbook was not necessary. Now it is standard operating procedure. Towing companies have invested in shallower vessels that can operate at lower water levels. Port operators have built flexible loading systems that let them adjust cargo weights as the river changes. Insurance products now exist specifically to cover losses from navigation disruptions. The industry is solving the problem it can see. This season, this drought, what it has not solved, and what no industry can solve alone, is the underlying direction. The pattern of more frequent and more severe and longer-lasting low-water events that is building across decades of data. The contingency playbook was supposed to be an emergency measure. It is becoming the business plan. Exceptional is becoming normal, and normal is becoming something no playbook fully covers. Climate projections for the Mississippi Basin are not ambiguous. The central and southern United States are expected to experience more frequent and more intense droughts as the decades ahead unfold. The precipitation patterns the agricultural heartland has relied on are shifting. The growing season is getting drier in the months when crops need rain and the river needs feeding. The ancient record goes further. Scientists studying tree rings and sediment layers going back centuries have found evidence of megadroughts in this basin. Droughts lasting not years, but decades. Droughts that would dwarf anything in the modern record. Droughts that would strand not 2,000 barges, but effectively shut down navigation for entire seasons at a time. Those conditions existed before. There is no reason they cannot exist again. The 2022 low water event was called historic at the time. It was. It was also, by the standards of what this river has survived in the deep past, a moderate preview of what is possible. Water managers and shipping analysts are beginning to have the conversation that climate scientists have been trying to start for years. The question is not whether severe low water events will keep coming. They will. The question is whether the infrastructure and the institutions and the political will exist to manage a river that is becoming less predictable every decade. So far, the answer is not reassuring. Stand at the bank of the Mississippi in Memphis on a day when the river is 45% below where it should be. The channel is there. The water is moving. The river has not stopped. But it looks wrong. Narrower than it should be. The sandbars wider. The exposed banks further out than any photograph from 20 years ago shows. Towboats moving slower than normal, reading their gauges every few minutes, picking their line through a channel that shifts week to week as the shallow river rearranges itself. The barges are riding high because they are not fully loaded. Somewhere upstream, a farmer is paying truck rates for a shipment that should have gone by barge. Somewhere downstream, a grain terminal is backed up with cargo that arrived faster than the shallow river can take it out. The river is still working, just not the way it needs to. Just not the way the economy that depends on it was built to assume it always would. The Mississippi has recovered from every low water event in its history. Every drought has ended. Every dry stretch has eventually given way to rain, and the river has risen back toward the levels that keep commerce moving. That is true. It is also the argument that has been used to avoid confronting what the pattern of those recoveries is starting to look like. The recoveries are real. They are also shorter each time. The lows are deeper each time. The frequency is increasing, and the infrastructure and the communities that depend on the river are not being rebuilt to account for a river spending more and more of its time in places it was never supposed to be. The Mississippi will not fail overnight. It does not announce its decline. It just gets lower and slower and more expensive to manage one drought at a time. Until the river that built the interior of America is no longer the backbone the country was built on the assumption it always would be, that day has not arrived. But the sandbars are already showing. And somewhere between St. Louis and New Orleans, right now ships are sitting in water that is not deep enough to carry them where they need to go. The clock is still running.